Now, as we think about culture, not only must we understand the culture in the perspective of the people have, but also we need to assess the needs within that community, within that culture. See, effective ministry requires that we understand and assess the needs of the community. We must understand their culture, but secondly, we must understand the needs of the culture and the needs of the people in the community. So that as we enter into a community, as we enter into their setting, to their livelihood, we begin to understand what are their needs. And that begins, first of all, by understanding their spiritual needs. And their first need is that people tend to be spiritual, but that does not mean that they're saved. It does not mean that they're redeemed. One of the mistakes that oftentimes people make in terms of rural America today is that the perception is that rural America is already evangelized. And the reason that people oftentimes have that perspective is because rural America tends to be very religious and very morally conservative. But that does not mean that they're spiritually redeemed, that they have a personal relationship with Christ. And so there is a critical need for evangelism in rural America, simply because people are religious, but they're not in that vital relationship with Christ. But the challenge is what makes evangelism difficult in rural America. If you walk up to the average person and say, "Do you believe in Christ?" they would say, "Yes, I do." "Do you pray?" "Yeah." "Do you go to church?" "Sometimes." But do you have a personal relationship with Christ where you're seeking to live in obedience to Him? And there's that spiritual need. Secondly, people tend to have an eclectic view of faith. Well, all ways are valid. There's a number of ways to get to heaven, and as long as you believe and are a good moral person, you'll get there. That tends to define the spirituality of our culture today. And we need to assess that. We need to understand the perspective people have. And then lastly, people have an inadequate view of Christianity. One of the mistakes that sometimes we make in assessing the spiritual needs is that we make the assumption that people understand what Christianity is all about. But as our country has become more and more post-Christian in their thinking, and more secular in their thinking, we need to recognize that they really don't have a right perspective of what Christianity is, what it means to be in relationship with Christ. That it's more than just a religion, but it's a personal relationship. So part of the evangelism process needs to be the introducing to them of what it means, what we're talking about when we're talking about being a Christian. So we need to assess what are the spiritual needs of the community, what are the spiritual perspectives that people have within the community. But not only must we assess the spiritual needs, we must also assess the social needs. Now, as we think about the social needs, especially in the non-metro areas, we need to recognize, first of all, there's an economic crisis in town and country areas. That there are many rural areas today that are facing significant economic issues that the church needs to be aware of in terms of ministry. Poverty is an extreme problem in many rural areas. In fact, in the year 2002, 14.2% of the population in non-metro areas were classified as poor, compared to only 11.6% in the metro areas. So that the rural poverty level oftentimes exceeds even that of the inner city. So that poverty is not just an inner city problem. 1 out of every 4 non-Hispanic, Black, and Native Americans in rural areas live in poverty. The non-poverty level for the non-Hispanic Blacks and Native Americans is 33% more, or 3 times more, than the non-Hispanic whites. A significant problem in rural America today. And part of that is because of the farm crisis. That as we look at the farm crisis and the collapse of the agricultural economy, that has had a significant economic impact upon rural areas. Here's a map that I'd like to show you that shows just the poverty issues that we see today in rural America. That the map, as you look at this map, the areas in the dark red are those that are chronically impoverished, that have over a 20% poverty rate in rural areas. Now, as you look at this map, there are several significant things that come out. First of all is the Native American population. That the areas, some of the areas, especially in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, are on the reservation areas that show a significant poverty level. You also see the poverty levels of Native American and Hispanics in in the southern portion of the United States. And then you have the Mississippi Delta and the Appalachians with African American populations. But what's even more interesting as we look at this map is if you compare this map to a map that shows degrees of rurality. In other words, these are counties that are more rural. And notice that the more rural that the county is, that is, counties that are not in close proximity to any kind of metro or economic base, the more rural the county, the closer it is to the poverty level. So that rural America is facing a crisis of poverty. 52% of non-metro Native Americans who are poor have incomes less than half of the poverty level. In the year 2002, 1 out of every 5 children living in rural America today lives under the poverty level. Significant poverty problems and difficulties in rural areas. But it's interesting, it's not only true in the U.S., it's also equally true in Canada. That as you look at where the highest poverty levels are in Canada, that we also see these same levels, again, in what would be classified as the farm belt of Canada, in Saskatchewan, in Alberta. Again, facing severe financial crisis. And it's in this crisis that the church is called to minister. That we are called to do more than just shake our heads and say, well, that's too bad that people are facing in poverty. That the church needs to minister, needs to reach out to the poor. And that's not just true of the inner city, but it's equally true of the rural areas. But here's where we struggle with on a cultural issue. Because in the culture of the rural area, there is a mindset that the reason a person is poor is because they're lazy and they're unwilling to work. And so there's this mindset that kind of looks down upon the poor and looks down upon those who are giving government assistance. And that infiltrates into the church. So oftentimes in the church, instead of being sensitive to and seeking to minister to the poor, we become judgmental of them. And then we wonder why we can't get them to come to church. If we're to be effective in outreach in terms of rural America, we have to rethink our attitudes about poverty within rural America. But not only do we see an economic collapse in rural America, but we also see a social crisis. Crime is not just an inner city problem. In fact, if we were to look statistically at the crime per capita, per 100,000 people per capita, that the crime rates in Montana and Kansas and other more rural states that we normally think of is higher than such more urban states as New Jersey and New York. So crime is not just a city problem. It's becoming more and more of a rural problem as we see an economic collapse that results in the social crisis of crime on the rise. We also see a crisis in terms of suicide. That the figures in terms of suicide, that rural male population committing suicide is significantly higher than the metro area suicide rate among males today. Alcoholism is becoming a significant problem, as alcohol has become the drug of choice in rural areas, especially on the Indian reservations, where Indian children suffer the effects of fetal alcohol syndrome at a rate 33 times greater than all other Americans. It's becoming a significant problem. So there's a social collapse that we see affecting rural ministry, so that rural ministry has to rethink how it does ministry. That we need to be dealing with some of the social issues if we're to reach people with the cause of Christ. We also see, in terms of rural America, demographic changes going on. Significant demographic. In some areas, there's high influx of people, and so there's a population growth. Now, as we look on a map, and we'll see this in a minute, the areas that are experiencing rapid demographic growth are the areas of high amenity areas, or areas that are in close proximity to metro areas that are becoming bedroom communities. But this is bringing in new challenges for the church. As we look at the church, it brings in new tensions as people move into these new communities within the church, that new people clash with established residents in relationships to values. Farmers and loggers and ranchers resent the new residents who are more environmental in their perspective. And that results in environmental clashes. For example, in northern Idaho, there was a significant legal battle has been going on for the last 5 or 6 years over the burning of bluegrass, a farming practice. And so newer residents who are coming from the city are clashing over environmental practices that the farmers had, and that creates resentment. New clashes over values about family life and community life. New people clash with longtime attendees in the church. New people come into the community, start coming to the church. They have different perspectives. They have different desires and expectations about worship, and about programs. And so they desire different programs and different styles of music or styles of doing worship. And it clashes with the older established styles. And so part of the task of the church is to help come alongside and bring reconciliation. Also, those areas that are experiencing demographic growth in the church are areas that experience struggles over power and authority. As new people come in and they want to take over the power structures of the church, if you would, and yet the power brokers who have been established in the church resent that, and so they become divided over these power struggles. So the church is facing those issues. Then there's other areas that are facing significant demographic decline, and these are the areas that are in the farm belt that are facing more of an economic crisis. So here's a map that shows this. You see that the areas of the blue are the areas that are showing substantial population growth, and the areas in the red are facing substantial population decline. And so you have the whole Midwest, or the farm belt, that is experiencing very significant decline as people are moving out of the areas because the farm economy has collapsed. There's no longer jobs available, and as a result, it affects the church. So the young people are no longer staying in the church, but they're migrating out of the church. And so we see today that one of the struggles that churches are facing in areas that are facing population decline is a loss of volunteers in the church. When I was in eastern Montana, in one of those areas that in the last 10 years has lost over 20% of its population. When I was there in 4 years, we had approximately about 30% of our church leave the community. They didn't just leave the church because they were dissatisfied, but they were leaving the church because they were leaving the community in search of jobs elsewhere. In 1 month alone, we lost our Sunday school teacher, our youth group leader, and a board member And in a small church, when you lose that kind of a volunteer base, it significantly impacts the church. Another area it impacts the church, and not only in the loss of volunteerism, but also in terms of the loss of the next generation of leaders. As the young people leave, the church gets older. And so, as I talk with pastors in small churches, oftentimes in many of these areas, they struggle because they say, we no longer have any young people in our church. And part of that is a result of just demographic changes going on in their community. It's reflected in the church. It also affects the movers and shakers. That those who are natural starters, those who are the go-getters in the church, those who are the type A personalities who want to get things done, they're the ones that are leaving. And it's creating a vacuum of leadership in the church. And so the challenge facing these rural churches is for new leadership development and new leadership growth. But we need to understand it. We need to understand what's going on in terms of the culture, in terms of the crisis that's occurring within the church. So as we think about ministry in the rural context, we need to understand that ministry, to be effective, must do more than just lead people. It must be part of the community. If we were to go into an inner city, we recognize that part of the inner city ministry is working with community renewal and dealing with some of these social problems. And we recognize that the church, to be effective, needs to be a part of that community, willing to enter into the community to present the gospel. But it's not just true of the inner city. It's equally true of the rural areas. That we need to be a part of the inner city. We need to be a part of the rural community. We need to be part of community revitalization. And we do that by becoming part of the social capital of the community. Now, when we talk about social capital, as you look at a community has economic capital. That's the economic base of the community. What people make, where they work, the type of jobs they have, what they can possibly earn, what is available to the community for economic growth. But we also see that, and sociologists talk about social capital within a community. And this is what the community has in terms of its ability to bring health and vitality to the community. Now, there's two levels of social capital. First of all, there's what is called bonding social capital. This is the partner relationships that exist between homogeneous groups. For example, on a church level, this would be the type of joint ventures that evangelical churches would join together to accomplish. So evangelical churches might join together to deal with a social issue in a community or deal with a moral issue in a community. And part of the social capital then is this close proximity that they have with one another and forming these partner relationships to benefit the community and help deal with issues in the community. A second level of social capital is what is called the bridging social capital. This is the partnering relationships with the diverse groups. So, for example, on a church level, this would be a church saying, let's partner together with the domestic violence, for example, to deal with issues related to domestic violence. So this is more diverse groups that may not agree on many of the value issues, but they come together for a common purpose. Other bridging issues might be coming together to deal with the sheriff's department and with social services, deal with crime issues or parenting issues. Or perhaps it's to deal with just the building of a new park or a new park playground equipment within the park. Or dealing with other parts of economic renewal. Community members getting together and thinking through how they can foster and support the economic renewal of the community. This is all part of being that social capital. So as we think about the church, we need to recognize that the church in a community is part of that social capital. That it includes the schools, it includes the service organizations, it includes the government agencies, but it also includes the churches. And we're part of that. And if we're to be effective in presenting the gospel, we need to be a part of that social capital, and we need to be, in many ways, the leader of that. Now, there's several things that we need to do. We need to be those who are willing to initiate social change in our community. Not as an end of itself. You see, the error of the social gospel was that the social gospel sought to present the gospel by dealing with social issues, but they never presented the gospel. They just dealt with social issues. So what happened was the evangelical world and the fundamentalists, especially back in the era that this was a hot topic, was that they then reacted by saying, no, we're there to present the gospel, and so they withdrew from the social issues. And we need to recognize today that if we are to be effective in reaching our community in a postmodern world, that we need to be a part of the social capital by initiating social change. So in the process, as we deal with social issues, we then have an avenue to present the gospel. Now, there's several things that we can do as we seek to initiate and help the community deal with these issues. First of all, we need to identify the needs. What are the needs in the community? The social needs. Are they economic? Is there moral issues? Are there drug issues? Are there teenage pregnancy issues that need to be addressed? So we need to identify the need. Secondly, we need to recruit interested groups or individuals to form a team, a group that will deal with those issues. And these we may look to other churches, we may even look to other community members to be a part of that community. Individuals who have that same concern that we have and want to see things addressed. And so we want to recruit those individuals. Then thirdly, we want to develop a team that will work together to focus and address these concerns within that community. Then we want to facilitate rather than lead. Doesn't mean that we take the lead and do all the work, but rather we want to come alongside of others and help them to deal with it so we can influence the community. Then we want to develop an action plan. Okay, what do we need to do? What can we do to meet these needs? Because if we're to be effective in the rural communities, if we're to be effective, we need to be more than just the church that meets at the corner. We need to be a church that's involved in the community, a church that is part of the social capital, because we're sensitive to the needs, we understand what those needs are, and we're willing to minister to those needs. See, that's why it's so crucial that we understand our culture if we're to be effective in the community. And then we need to understand the needs. What are the needs out there, and how can we minister to those needs? And then we can be effective in ministry.